Hello, everyone. As you're filing in, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the Brooklyn Rail's 620th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Tiona Nekkia McClodden and Ayanna Dozier. We are really thrilled to welcome poet Asiya Wadud here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on the Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Visual artist, filmmaker, and curator Tiona Nekkia McClodden explores and critiques issues at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and social commentary. McClodden's interdisciplinary approach traverses documentary film, experimental video, sculpture, and sound installations. Her recent work explores re-memory and narrative biomythography. Brooklyn-based artist, writer, and Rail contributor Dr. Ayanna Dozier centers film, performance, and installation in her artistic work with a specific concentration on surrealist, conceptual, and feminist practices. Her films have screened at festivals across the US and the UK. She is the author of Janet Jackson's The Velvet Rope, 2020, and is currently working on a manuscript on the life of abstract film artist Camille Billups. Thank you all again so much for being here. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ayanna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chloe and Carolyn, for organizing this and for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Hopefully I don't get darkened out in terms of the sun varying degrees in its lighting, but yeah, so welcome, Tiona. I'm so excited to talk to you. I have a lot of things to, point to, but I think the first thing to talk about in relationship to this magnificent trio of shows that you have right now in New York, which of course, a trace of implied presence at the Shed, as well as your exhibition Mass Concealed Carry at 52 Walker, and then the restaging of On Subjugation at MoMA, which occupies its own gallery space. And I do want to touch upon all three of those pieces, how they relate to your practice. But I think to start, what makes sense perhaps is thinking about how you work through all of these varying mediums and approaches and outputs with regards to a kind of process-oriented enactment. For me, what it's always made sense about your work is that the body, as you live it, as you work through your own self, then becomes part of the work, right? So as you're navigating various spaces of queer community, BDSM, that then gets cycled into the artistic practice. Like that is also its own process, as opposed to what we often think of the process-oriented approach with like the painter who's like figuring out a new paint or something. So I was wondering if you can just speak a little bit about that. That might perhaps provide an entry for audiences coming in so we can get to those other pieces.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a system that I have set up for myself that allows me to kind of ensure that I have the ability to do something new every time while still having something that kind of grounds me. And it is the same thing every single time. It's like I have a very aggressive research and study that's almost like a 70% type thing. And then there's like the other part has me thinking very much about my own personhood at all times, like where I'm like, and not just like some kind of thing that I've said, this is it, like, but like, where am I at in my life? And then I usually, if I'm dealing with a particular topic community, then I seek someone else to kind of like counter me and also like counter the research, because I'm always looking for like this space between a truth and fact element. So that the core element of my practice is the what allows me to do that is how I kind of think through Black men's effect. And that comes from originally being in a documentary practice and trying to figure out how to get to the more difficult thing, which comes up in like anthropological studies, sociological studies, when you think about people or a culture. And mental fact is always the hardest to make sense of because it's literally how people think. And so I think that creates the circumstances for me to have something that is like extraordinarily difficult to handle, which means that the material always has to be different. It means that I can never do the same thing because it's almost like very hostile in thinking about that trying to make material of thought. And then the last thing I'll share is that, it also keeps me in a space that starts to help me to align myself and think about Black folks as conceptual thinkers, like thinking about conceptual practice and assigning and starting to like believe and execute a certain kind of intellectual reference to whoever it is, not academics, not, like anybody who I'm like kind of get glamored by the way they think,
No, absolutely. I think there's points I want to draw upon in that response, but I'll start with the last bit that you mentioned of like Black individuals as conceptual thinkers, because when we think of Black studies, not necessarily located within the academy, but just as a larger field, which encompasses, Black literary works, Black film, Black dance, Black art, etc. Just the idea of a Black study. It's one of those few areas that in its origin, in its understanding, it's multidisciplinary, right? It has to have all of these divergences. It needs to be heterogeneous because the history of, not just white supremacy, but institutional references and implementation of white supremacy has always been around this narrative of disciplinary specificity that excluded and kind of marginalized various groups of people. So for Black study, then it's always had to be, well, okay, I can't make it in this field, right? Let me become a writer, right? And let me utilize that as a space for philosophical thought, which is why so many of us continue to cite Toni Morrison. Yes, she was a master literarist, but she also, in my opinion, was a key philosopher of our time. So I think in that sense of constantly taking in this aspect, a little bit of this and this and that, it is very organic to honoring that commitment of Black study. To that end, though, I want to kind of probe you a bit further in thinking about where your origins are with documentary film, and especially that anthropological focus that is, put upon you in the field of documentary that is also bears strong resemblance to not just colonization, but an ethno-centralizing of the narrative, right? Like the only way we can interpret it is through this one linear force, which I would say is counter to the work that you do, but also the kind of sources that you draw inspiration from. What was that tension like when you started to recognize it earlier on in your practice? Were there any specific films that you were doing where you started to grapple with that and realize that it needed to become more heterogeneous as you're doing this work that was almost basically counter to the institutional mandate that you should have been doing it for?
Yeah, absolutely. I got some friends who are in this thing who could tell you how real this is. I just finished my first film, 2008, Black Women Conversations with Lesbians of African Descent, and kind of was pulled into this like insane run on like film festival circuits and things like that. And I saw, the positionality of that work, or the position I took within that work, is that I was like going to work until it was finished. So it was about a 7-year kind of adventure. And coming out of that, then there was another film that I made, which is a short film, Bumming Cigarettes. And that's when I started to kind of like have this little break from the core documentary. You're gonna hear my cat yelling, she misses me. But kind of had this break from wanting to do, I was like, something has to be both fiction, nonfiction, this hybridity thing that I wanted to deal with. Primarily, it's like very selfish thing. It's like, I realized that there was something in me where I could follow something forever. And I was like, I needed to start to figure out how to like, put a foot down and kind of like take the lead. And so from there, playing within, again, it's like the emergence of the truth versus fact thing, this hybridity element of like, thinking more even about, like Audre Lorde biomythography, that's how it comes in, wanting to kind of stretch and deal with like how I can meet both. And that is what set me on a particular path to kind of assess what my issue was, which is like, I'm not bound and I'm not interested in hardcore ethnography. I always had an issue with it as someone who was like, like studying this and participating and had to like kind of take in a particular understanding and a reading of the films, the text that, people like consider these grails, these like hardcore referential models. And then, what that ended up doing is like leading me more or closer to myself and wanting to get a hold of not only the way that I thought, but actually disclose that as a particular position. So I could be very, explicit in what I was doing. And so I think right now there's a way to think about like autoethnography. Like I think I found interest in how to like have this something that is very personal, but also, critical and also has bias. I actually like bias. Like I'm not making anything and, I'm, like leaving it up. Like I have a statement, there's a period, but there's also like room for discussion. So I think that's kind of maybe what, you're asking. I think that's how I felt about the journey that helps me make sense of how I'm here right now, like these things that I have up.
Yeah. Completely relate to all of that. So I want to come back to the Audre Lorde reference, biomythology, and specifically Zambia, new origin of my name or new spelling of my name, as an entry point for you, helping you make sense of the bias. And also I would maybe add to that as a response, maybe you're both holding yourself accountable for your life in a way that is also attentive to the other lives around you. And we often don't encounter that, right? Especially in the space of academia or even in the space of, ethnography coming out of documentary film. The accountability of the person doing the work is not supposed to stain the research, right? You're not supposed to talk about your feelings or maybe the fact that you might be traumatized by the work that you're doing. That's an impression that needs to be left to the side. The work is supposed to take center for that. And I know in my own research that I had no way of reconciling that. And I had to figure out some other kind of process for it, because I felt, if anything, the trauma I'm experiencing doing this work, the sadness, the grief, the happiness, whatever, like that is shaping and informing what I choose to pursue, how I choose to pursue it. And on one hand, we do have, a method of approach that has become very, I wouldn't say popular, but has been resurrected by largely artists that is now kind of yo-yoing back to the institution of, critical fabulation, a la Saidiya Hartman, as she wrote about in Scenes of Subjection, rather, of this moment of doing research on enslaved bodies. You can't go into these institutions of oppression and then take what they have at face value, because you're looking for property when you're looking for people. Like it's already a disconnect there, that you have to find some other alternative to make sense of that work. And of course, she expands upon that later in Lose My Mother, as well as Venus in Two Acts. However, I would say, and I don't know if you would have thoughts about this, but which is why I want to kind of pull us back to Lorde here. There's a way in which perhaps critical fabulation, which is necessary, and I want to be very clear, this is not me coming down upon it, but I would say that maybe it doesn't necessarily speak to what you were just describing, and why that Lorde reference, specifically that mythologizing your own life, the kind of turning your life into a myth, as you're doing this work about archives and on other people's livelihood, that perhaps that is also something separate from what seems to be more in vogue right now around critical fabulation. Would you agree, disagree?
No, I agree. That's not like, I'm just listening. Nice to hear somebody talk. I don't like for a while. I've been talking too much. So I think, yeah, I think that that's the case. There's also something that I'm interested in. I veer towards a 1 foot in, 1 foot out position when it comes to this, like this academic thought, or also like the framing of these ideas of fabulation versus like biomythography, which I feel is like on the ground a little bit more for me. Which is, people can kind of get it in their hands a little bit more. I mean, I want to also throw in Tavia's, the queer fabulation work that I really resonate with the way that he's figured the scenes, or the particular examples that he's like working through. It's giving me a lot of affirmation when I'm thinking about what I'm doing. But yeah, biomythography for me, and this is just, again, it's like there's 3 things: the Black Mentifact, Rememory for Toni Morrison, and biomythography. Those are things that are seated in my artist statement that I always like have to question myself with whatever I'm doing. But with biomythography, I will say that, the way that came up for me had very much about wanting to make sense of my own biography, as well as my family's biography in this country, and have it be something just as grand, just as mythical as some of the figures that have been chosen by the larger class of, like, where there's academics, political, whatever, historians, and it kind of allowing a certain kind of touching of hands to be in proximity to be like just as important as this, so that's where it comes from me. And with that, there's a little bit of the stretch, there's a little bit of the lean in of the the story that's told, and kind of like playing with that, not just going and trying to say this couldn't have happened, this person wasn't here, the weather wasn't like this type shit. It's like I like to dance in the story element. And I go both ways, like, it's like the story that's captured that I can present, but then also there's the thing that I can go handle and then turn into an object, like that I can go turn into a particular scenario. So yeah.
Yeah, I think on that end, I want to relate what you just said back to what I would say, maybe looking on the outside of your practice, what feels like a massive turning moment is the Brad Johnson tapes.
Yeah.
And I
said massive.
Yeah. And the relationship you started to develop with working through their archive and committing to it across installation, film. I'm also thinking of your 2017 film Labyrinth, and how not only, as you mentioned with Toni Morrison's Rememory, which, if memory serves me right, that passage is kind of delivered in relationship, not just to beloved as before she takes on her body, like when she's the spirit just haunting the house and, killing the dog and like causing other people to flee. But again, when her mother's leg is dead, and I'm always reminded of that passage, if not haunted by it, where she's like fallen and she's being helped out, and it's like anything dead coming back to life is going to hurt.
Yes.
And that there's going to be a visceral embodied pain in response to that.
Yeah.
And I've connected Rememory to that it's not just a kind of, oh, we're coming back to this moment and we're bringing it to the present to inform our future, but rather it is literally resurrecting the dead. And that's painful. Like that, there has to be some pain in that. And, perhaps the next question we can start to segue into, Afro spirituality and Afro-Cuban spirituality. But I guess what I'm hinting in or gesturing towards is that kind of ambiguity of pain that circulates your work a lot, and specifically with the archive of Brad Johnson, and how it's neither, there's no condemnation, there's no judgment around it, there's no positive representation, it's neither this nor that, it simply is there. There is just pain as part of how we do this work that isn't enacted literally in your body as you're doing it to kind of manifest that to an audience. So yeah, if you can walk me through that particular moment in your life, encountering that archive, resurrecting it, and then and how it starts to open up these vestibules of experiencing and dealing with pain more significantly across your performance and installation work.
Yeah, and one thing, like with that, I agree with everything you said, but with that project, what I want to start off by saying is that it is not a performance. It's the residue of a particular experience. The Brad Johnson on Subjugation X, which is like in this installation countered with the Essex and Audrey piece from A Fixing Ceremony. It is a work that is literally the residue of an ordeal that I put myself through purposely and consensually, where I'm in, I took the month of August of 2017, top bottom, and went through these different scenes of like engaging his text and trying to match or create a particular harmony between an action that's tied to SM while reading it, to then enact a particular like proximity to this like splitting of self. So like the jouissance, which is what I kind of process the work through. The action of like something that is a description of a feeling, but also the thing itself, like an action. So just to like start there with that work and create that kind of space and think about that dynamic that was in place for myself. Yes, pain is the greatest form of self-care that the human has. It's like the thing that lets you know where you're at and where you don't need to be, and it also is something oddly kind of can go into this other place of how you hold it. Like if you're like to be sore and to press, like, as an athlete, pressing the wound, engaging the bruise, the aching muscle, that you almost have to go into a place of like pain to then actually push the hurt out, if that makes any sense. Like get it, like to kind of like jump the body alive. So I kind of approach that all, from the physical, it's like very haptic work, from this like basic physical desire, but also this like wanting to almost like cut and pull something out of myself at the same time, just because I thought that what he was able to give me in relationship to language, 2 acts that I participate in. Now here's language that's very beautiful and lush, but extraordinarily sharp. Then there was something that I felt like I wanted to take and then almost like see if it's really real. Like it was almost like a romantic, it's actually very romantic work for me, but I wanted to test the limits and see if it's real, and also have this like kind of dance and engagement. And also knowing that in those moments and, kind of thinking more, and this is like very interior language for players, but like subspace, dom drop, meeting itself creates this like moment of like, it's like you're without language. And so I kept trying to get to that thing across this month so that I could have that as a particular residue. The tape, with that work, there is a tape that's here in this shelf like next to me that contains all of that, right? And I refer back to it because it is a certain kind of like visual like text for me that has found its way in other works. Like the work that's up now on the screen, this is actually a child of that work. Like I can look at that tape and now I have a particular kind of language for things that I need to embody and sensory stuff that I want to put into, my leather paintings, for instance. So, but it's like, it's just very tender work. It's a very lush work. It's not as brutal as I think some people figure it for me. Like the thing that I came is like a feeling of being completely taken by desire and love, like or something like that. Yeah. So, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about, especially with regards to BDSM, what I'll maybe offer here, but also put a pin that I kind of want us to end there and kind of have a more expanded dialogue around it. But that oftentimes, if we don't look at the popular images of BDSM, which are terribly skewed, we recognize it, or we can recognize it often as a space where a lot of people in their lives, I would say primarily women, or even non-binary folks, that's where they first learn consent, like or a dialogue around consent. Because especially if you think of heterosexual couplings, that's not part of heterosexual culture. Like testing is not part of heterosexual culture. So when individuals who are only used to that venture into these other spaces, like that's the rule number one. Like, we need to talk about consent. What are you okay with? So I do think that as you're talking about the kind of, not just the desire examined, but the opening of care that comes out of that is very vital for not only rethinking how maybe a larger audience thinks of BDSM or any acts of perceived self-inflicted violence of the such, but more about how do we also re-examine that these are often spaces that, in order to even participate, vital conversations around your body, what you want, desire, affection, consent are central to even beginning in ways that they're not central to what we think of normative or safe arrangements, which in fact often have more violence within them.
I've had to tell people several times, like, because with that work comes a particular conversation.
Right.
Is that the play is, if not like 75% talk and 25% action. And, like part of the, space that I have, or the participation as a member of that community comes from, I feel like that's like the intellectual powerhouse of this whole LGBTQ thing that a lot of people, have going on. It's like, there's a lot of like dialogue, and there's a lot of like figuring yourself and your desire, and taking time to be articulate, and a lot of negotiating, a lot of boundaries. So there's something very powerful that I've had come from that space and those experiences. So I think that's kind of, I don't know, that's what I hope that people would think about a little bit more, which is why the text is like, like the text becomes the kink, in this work. Like I'm trying to get off on the language, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah.
I mean, well, let's just have this conversation now, then I'll get to the Afro-Cuban spirituality bit. But because so what it also reminded me of is, again, I keep going back to Labyrinth. It's something I've written about. It's one of my favorite pieces in general. But I remember you describing that of like, as you just said, the text is the kink, where I remember reading that poem, and it's one of those moments where you're like, oh wow, this is really hot. Like there's no images, there's no, there's no graphic visual things happening, and yet you are affected, physically arrested by the wordplay and what it then allows you to kind of conjure up. And it's specifically because it's coming from this space of, consensual subjugation in these other, alterities of sexuality and sex play that I would say, and this is far more open-ended, but increasingly not even within just a kind of heterosexist realm, was kind of stigmatized, but increasingly over the past, decade, even within queer spaces, is now kind of turned a hard right towards respectability. Denying the kind of radical, not just activism, and I do mean literal activism that also came from these spaces, the radical ways of embodiment that, do exactly what Brad Johnson was able to do, and what your work alludes to of like, I was transformed through this experience of othering myself in pursuit of desire. And I think there's something to be said about that. I think that especially at that intersection then of not just with Brad Johnson, but also with your body, of race and that split of gender, that there's a doubling demand around Black women that if then we need to pursue sexuality, it cannot be this, like it cannot be this. And what that actually denies audiences and other Black women from actually realizing about themselves when they do have this as a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a heavy thing to, discuss. And I mean, I taught a class, like, I'm teaching this class again at Princeton. It's a class on Black BDSM material culture, like looking specifically at queerness. And the first part, like the way that I've approached it to kind of have these conversations is to the first, 14 weeks, the first 10 weeks is all reading, right? Then the last 4 weeks, we actually look at images and we have to talk about them in a very particular way. And I have a massive archive of this. because this is preparation for like a curatorial project that I'm trying to do. So I think about how to create a space for language before the image. And I think that is the thing about porn that's sometimes unsettling for me, is because people are seeing something in a moment. They're not seeing what's happening before. And I think that when it gets to like documentation or what people think of, you know, SM and play, they're seeing like something like after, or they're seeing like something that's just caught in this moment, but it's very shaky, like it's a shaky field, it's a shaky scene. And I love that, like trembles, you know what I mean? Like in a good way. So I think that there's you know, I think of this moment, I'm very excited about kind of being on the other side, a good 5 years away from that original presentation, to see how it sits now, where people seem to be in this place where they've had to negotiate a particular kind of dynamic, and we've had to lean on language more. We haven't been in proximity with each other in a certain way. There has been a different way that you've had to figure out desire that may be like a little distanced or require a little bit more before we get to it, because of just this state of the society and the culture that we're in. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for there to be a conversation, and for like, you know, Black women, you know, specifically, but Black queer folks to have this conversation and understand that it's not something that needs to stay so deeply underground, because it goes either way. It's like either it's like something that's like aggressively pushed to the subterranean, or it's something that is just completely eaten up, even within the queer community, as this aestheticized device. You know what I mean? Like there's a moment, you know, where I was like completely confused. My head was spinning, because like, you know, there are people walking around with stuff on, and it, you know, these things mean something. So I was just like, I don't even know if you know what this thing means. But I was just very confused, you know, very confused. And I use that as a joke, because people like, you know, like, what does it mean to, these are things that have come up before, like way in 2017, what does it mean to show this? I'm like, people walking around dancing.
Names.
I was like, at least I'm going to show you and give you some context so you know what I'm doing. Like, you know, explicit, like this is what this is type thing. But yeah, I think anything that evades a certain legibility, and that's the beauty of you know, kink and SM, BDSM play, is that there's entire different kind of like interior iconography tied to language, tied to consent, tied to protocol, tied to, you know, like, so there's like, you know, there's it, and I don't think people understand that, but I hope that it invites them to understand that this is an extraordinarily, remarkably complex engagement and identity, you know, that kind of pushes up against, and somebody said, and ritual, yes, indeed. So this,
Thank you, whoever put that comment up there. A great transition, because it is very ritualistic, right? And it, you know, as we're going through a lot of your imagery, and I'm thinking about how the first question kind of prompted is, you know, your living, right, experiences is the process, right, that jumpstarts the work, and that living through those things helps you approach the work that comes out of it. And so much of then your, you know, object-oriented pieces that emerge on display, they have such a rich materiality to them, and not just like because they're like objects, but because they are, you know, these totems, if I may, of that past experience. Even as you were talking about on Subjugation X, you know, that everything that comes out of that is, you know, a marker, not of a performance, but of that very particular experience, that then, even as you gesture to the videotape, you know, next to you, like invites you to go back to that moment. Which is precisely then what, you know, a kind of relic does, is it kind of pulls you back, but also bringing in whatever transformative properties it had at its moment to the present by just existing in that space. And a lot of your leather work for me does that in a really, you know, beautiful, delicate way, that even though it's shrouded behind this perceived perception of, you know, pain in a negative way, I think of it again with regards to ambiguity. And the reason why I keep using ambiguity is now, as we're looking at your work at the Whitney, what I appreciate about your work when you do allow audiences to understand your process around Afro-Cuban spirituality,
Mhm.
which I do think is such a gift, because that can be very, very privatized. It is centered around that ambiguity. I think in our what's the buzzword, toxic positivity culture,
Yeah.
everyone's a witch now. Everyone's like, yes, my sun and my rising sign, awesome. But there's not space for the fact that a lot of these practices, there's violence in them, there's that ambiguity, there's sacrifices, there are ritual enactments, there are initiation rituals
Mhm.
that still require the body to go through something. In my own experiences, I'm a Hudo spiritualist, and I had to go through a fasting process for 3 days, and that's not, that wasn't fun. There's no cute thing I can do on Instagram to be like, I like this. So I think in understanding that it's ambiguous, it's not, a negative violence, but it simply just is, because that is also life. I'd love for you to say more about that kind of use of the ambiguity of violence and ritual that not only bleeds into, your own work on BDSM, but critically with this incredible installation that you had at the Whitney several years ago at the Biennial.
Yeah. I'm an above ground practitioner at the request of the Orisha, like, you know what I mean? Like, but it's like this whole thing, part of this thing that people say is private, that stuff is negotiable. It's about really what you're going to show and what you're not. Like, most that's included in the Whitney project. There were a lot of people who were like, oh my gosh, you're showing all this stuff. And I was like, you don't even know what you're looking at. You know what I mean? Like, like you don't, it's just like the American eyes are just, so I like that. Like that I could show you stuff that's hidden in plain sight. And I think that the signal, and this is for all of my work, because I do have a particular mindfulness around what it means to be me, but also what it means to be a part of these different formations of identity and culture. So, each work is a success for me when the person who is the audience is a part of the community, and they feel like they have something that they can see that someone who is not a part of the community doesn't. Right. So when I had this work up, the amount of people who were practitioners who were able to come and like talk to me about stuff and be thrilled in this way, it was like us having the moment of what it means to actually be in this world. You know what I mean? As these like kind of people who have to do this particular kind of work. And so, I mean, that's what the work was. I mean, there's a couple of things, because I haven't really, talked too much about that work. In the way that I think that I can say very shortly here is like, when being invited to the Whitney Biennial, which was not something exactly I thought that would ever happen based on the kinds of work that I was making and the ways that I was working, and even like not living in the scene of the art stuff. The proposition for me is that I took on this idea of like a positionality and thinking about this like Black, what does it mean to like this American, art? What is that? What does it mean for me to think about really where I'm at? And it was very detailed. Like I was literally within my 6-year practice, Shango's number 6. And I had a lot of these spiritual readings that kept telling me about like having to do work with Shango. And as a child of Ogun, that I was just like, y'all, like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? And it had everything to do with like trying to embody a particular confidence that just wasn't there, like a certain kind of be in the worldness, not in the extreme ways of like Shango, but like there was something that I needed. And so it was such a demand that I had to make my work, like my spiritual work, it had to be my work. And so that was what that, the work was, but it fell on that time. Everybody's having conversations about 400 years, since, slavery. And I was just like, this work to me is something that kind of like gestured towards, this is what it looks like inside of me as a person who has this thing that is the residue, right? That is the, thing that I had to fight, that tried to come throughout my bloodline and came to me, and I'm the one that stepped up and did it, you know what I mean? As this like Black, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's hard. It is hard. But and then I then, pre the wildness that then happened around repatriation in the work, like, I'm like, I have it. Hey, here, America, I'm actually going to take it back. I'm going to take it with my hands that also are the hands of this Black queer person that maybe is not even accepted in particular spaces. And I'm going to go and I'm going to pray. I'm going to present this to the place that it's taken from, and I'm going to pray. And it was a very, very like mission driven, probably one of my most dangerous works because I was like, was gone, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it you know, it's one of those things again, it's like, it's just look at what my life is. Look at this moment.
Yeah.
And also like, let's have a conversation about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that subtle shade
What?
towards a project that was about 400 years?
No, I'm not shading nobody. I was like, wait, what? No. Yes.
If it is, I welcome it.
So here, if there's it's not a shade, because I think that stuff is important, right? Like, because I'm like, I tell people, you know, and the way that I enter that is like, I like am raised in South Carolina, and one of the reasons that I kept moving away is because I'm like, every 5 seconds, everything is about reminding me that I was enslaved. So I was just like, there's no way for me to get to where I'm at right now, and I think do the work that I'm supposed to do. So I was like, I have to get out. I have to get out of South for a minute. And Philly, right? Like, to just let people know why I'm here. Philly is the energy that's on Black folks here is like free Black folks. Like, I've never not, you know, like, even though there's clearly oppression, there's also enslavement here. But the way the movement, some of the things that Black folks here were able to get and maintain over all those years, the energy is what I needed, and I wanted to be around it. It's almost like a chest out, you know, energy. Like, we not on that. Yeah. So what I will say could be like a maybe subconscious shade is that I felt they left, you know, that where's the queer voice? Is too, that the shit is too square for me. Like, it's like almost like it's too heteronormative. It's too like, you know, it's like, dare I say, a lot of the people who were you know, proclaiming this are some you know, like people who identify within this Africanness, Pan-Africanist thing. And I'm just like, you're play right now. I am it. Like I'm doing this. Like, you're wearing, you know, this is interior talk, but I don't care. But like, you're wearing the, you know, the cloth. I have the cloth, like, you know what I mean? Like, I've gone through the, you know, and it's like wild to have, I think a lot of the conversations that I was in be kind of like marginalized or pushed out as someone who's actually like a practitioner, you know what I mean? And having to like have a certain kind of risk. So that's where maybe the shade is jumping out a little bit, but I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it.
I welcome it. I guess what I want to do is, and I now want to kind of move us into your recent body of work, but for me, I think with that project, we'll keep it vague. I feel like it's obvious, but we'll keep it vague. It's too stable, right? The narrative history is too stable. There is no stabilization in that past, you know? And what was also rightfully pointed out, and what I really appreciated in your work, I Pray to the Wrong God, which came out roughly around that time period of those conversations, is that the focus on the Caribbean, you know, and the Caribbean is a matrix of just fragmentation, just splintering because of it. But there is no understanding or narrative of the African-American without the Caribbean.
Exactly.
And you can't do that work and then focus on, you know, whatever happened in the mainland Turtle Island and exclude the ports, the holdovers, the passages, the creolization, the extreme violence, right? The plantations of the Caribbean that gave birth to then these fragmentations here. And so it felt very, it felt like trying to do the history of Black study, as I outlined earlier, through, if we want to use Audre Lorde, through the master's tools, which are all about stabilizing and fixing, if not, as Frantz Fanon said, petrifying history into being one thing. So it just felt very odd to kind of deploy the same institutional structures of singleization, making things into a singularity with our own narrative, in my opinion. So
yes, I agree.
I welcome shade.
I agree. It's good. You know, I'm like, I like it.
So on that note, you do have, as I alluded to at the beginning, we do have this trio of work, and I know, I don't know, I can't see the chat because I have my extra light in front of my computer, but I know around this point, if there are questions, if people want to start filtering that in, that would be a time, and we'll start taking those around 2 o'clock. But with this trio of work, I think that each of the pieces on view speak to, you know, the totality of your practice thus far. And I want to start with the biggest of them, at least in scale, the trace of implied presence on view right now at the Shed, which, you know, as a former dancer, I was there at the opening, and I was telling my friends, I knew that we could walk on the floors, but I couldn't. I was so like, you're supposed to take your shoes off.
Yeah.
As you have these different dance floor stages kind of, you know, repurposed here in front of these screens that delve into that pedagogy, not just, you know, interviewing dancers. Specifically at the center of this is Mickey Shepherd, beautiful, wonderful choreographer, but of course, was the kind of instrumental to Dance Black Festival at BAM.
Dance Black America, yeah.
Several, not even several years ago, almost 40 years ago now. And kind of working with her living archive, which I remember you noted to me is the first time you kind of worked with a living archive where you can still be in conversation with them. If you want to say more about that particular unfolding of this project, and then also the way in which you've taken your interest in pedagogy and all the things we've just talked about, and now we see it more clearly with dance. Not that you haven't done dance before, but it's here really on display.
Yeah. That's definitely purposeful. You know, the short of it is like, you know, going into the archive and deciding to look at the 80s one more time, because I had come before that. I, you know, dealt with, you know, my triptych with Julius Eastman, Essex Hemphill, and Brad Johnson. You know, it's like these are particular figures that had their moments of coming into whatever they are and were happened in that time, and it just ended up being something that was a read on you know, these Black gay men who were producing work at the height of the AIDS epidemic. You know, therefore taking in consideration all the things that they're wrestling with in society. So I went, you know, I was invited by BAM. This is very important to know. I was invited by BAM, you know, through a curator at the time. And I didn't necessarily care too much for the curator, but I liked BAM. And so I said I wanted to come because BAM has been an extraordinarily crucial institution in terms of like the ways that I educate myself, which is on my own, like a self-education path. So I've participated in film festivals there. I go there to see their productions, really, really beautiful stuff. And so I took it as the opportunity to look at their ham archives, which I had never considered. They have a very beautiful archive that's run by a lovely archivist, Sharon Lerner, who was the person who helped me ultimately, once I saw the DBA archive and was like kind of taken by it. This, you know, Dance Black America takes place in 1983. And it's a 3-day festival that looks at 300 years of Black dance in America, or just poses the question of thinking about dance that is performed by Black people and what it could be or couldn't be. And it was very successful in like terms of commercial success, in terms of like, you know, saving the institution from some financial stuff success, but also just it was the first gesture that brought a lot of people into that institution, that showed them that they had a place there. So I was really flattered by like the archive was stunning. Mickey Shepherd stood out. Patricia Kerr Ross was considered also a co-programmer, a curator. She had passed away. And she was like the institutional collegiate sponsor to allow some of the funds and things like that to happen, to make it happen back in the 80s. Mickey was alive. The archivist put us in touch. I had a conversation with Mickey and told her that, you know, I was just so like taken by how organized this archive was, and I could see her care because it's so well organized with everything, like how she paid them, how she wrote all, you know, gave people, these dancers, their first bios, how she like, you know, which was so important. And then ultimately the program, which was just like a stunning like artifact for me, that just held the same weight of any kind of book. And I told her, I said, I looked at all this stuff and I'm interested in doing something. And I don't want it to be like how my other work is. I actually want to be in conversation with you. I'm like, I'm not going to go do something. It's like, you're here. I still want to learn. Like, I want to learn from you. I literally told her, it's like, I actually want to learn from you. And I want to pull something forward and kind of create some like maybe odd addendum of sorts to this thing, And so over the years, especially with this project, and I'll skip all that, the pandemic happened. Bam, that relationship split, and then I had to go figure out a different kind of way of getting this done. And for the sake of time, I won't go into it, but basically I was like, Nike, worked with them, secured a particular partnership with them. And through that partnership, then they were able to like allow me to utilize space at the shed. So this is very important that people know, like, I wasn't chosen by the shed to do this project. Like, I worked with Nike, and then Nike like facilitated the shed as a space for it. And so the content and the form that I took is that I wanted to do a series of portraits. I wanted to go talk to a few dancers that were dancing within forms that I felt still needed to have a particular like explication, to them, and that also are still a little shaky within the ways that we think about Black dance or dancers, and how they dance as Black, folks. And so tap dance was my first. I was like, I have to, I want to deal with it, you know what I mean? And so Michael J. Love, who's up now, amazing tap dancer, choreographer, and a scholar. So he's like a dancer who also like has a hand in contextualizing himself, which was a very powerful move for me. Audrey and June Donaldson, the Philly Bop, the project I did in 2018 that I had as a Magnum Fellow, that as a social dance, people really don't know about social dance. Yeah. It's very invisible. It's like it takes place in these like cabarets, church basements, older folks' homes, and it's part of a community that I spent with for a year. Like on Tuesday, I'm going to their class. Like you can come to Philly, and it's like it's happening. And so they were important to be a part of it because I wanted to show something that was still having also a little trouble as well, because it's older people who are dealing with, and young people aren't taken to it, right? So yeah. It's something that could possibly die. Then Rod Rogers Dance Company. I wanted a dance company that had the namesake of a choreographer. Rod Rogers participated as a dancer in the original DBA. He's one of those dancers that's just very gifted, or artist that's gifted, and secured a building in New York, has the dance company, and his principal dancer, Kim Greer Martinez, took over the company as artistic director, and that's why we, have them today. So their portrait is like a portrait of the building, portrait of the dance company, and a portrait of her as a dancer. And then last but not least is Leslie Sujay, who is a, contemporary experimental modern dancer, and is working through a particular field and thinking about herself as an artist and her, body as material, which I find very fascinating. She also happens to be the great niece of Marion Sujay, who is like, the kind of godmother of Black dance in this country. So, and they dance, I felt like thinking about that historical, like, someone who's quite frankly, she has a birthright to this particular kind of brilliance and this knowledge, and she's doing something that's so different from, her ancestor, who is like very formal, ballet, tip top, you know what I mean? And then, Leslie's like all about this, but outside of that, the last thing I'll share with this one, because this project is probably the hardest thing I've worked on in a long time. But the goal for me was I had an opportunity to scale up. I had an opportunity to think about a couple of things which were very important to me, because I have a lot of peers who are performers in the art scape, or whatever, the art world industry. And I don't think we treat them good, and I think that there's this thing that's was getting a little out of control, where I don't like to see dancers activating artwork like that's not theirs. It's like, for me, I'm just like, I've actually had to refuse that happening at exhibits. They're like, we're going to have a dancer. I'm like, no.
Not.
Yeah, we're not going to dance around, like my art. And it's just like they're used as these programmatic agents Or if they get invited, they like have to do these grueling schedules, almost like Broadway's like 2-3 performances every day. And I'm just like, something that's weird. So I took the time to think a little bit about what this Nike thing was. And, you know, I'm one of the first artists that they've ever worked with who had a kind of deal with them that didn't make a product. So like when the product is an exhibit. So some of the core values are about their principles and their ideas around movement. And so I asked all my dancers about, told them about this opportunity, and every single one talked about, you know, they asked me a question about if the floor was concrete. And it was the first time I took into account that that was a horrific stage, but it's a stage that I've seen so many dancers dance on. And they do it so well. And I was just like, holy shit, they're like suffering in silence. Like, what's going on? So I decided that there was going to have to be a kind of artistic hand, heavier. And I decided the floors would be the sculptures, and then I have my tracers, my mirrors. But with the floors, I was able to go back and ask them about the best floor that they danced on. And each one told me, and then I went and had that floor made. And then I had it endowed like kind of with these particular supports. Like, so these are sprung wood floors, all of them, which allow a certain kind of absorption of the impact. But each one, like, you know, Leslie, I was like, what kind of floor do you want? I got you on the wood, but what do you need? And she's like, Marley. And then she's like, can you get me white Marley? Done. You know, my boppers, they're like, okay, we got the wood floor, but we need a certain floor with a certain grip that lets me slide or something. So I had to get a certain kind of texture to that floor done. Rod Rogers, Black Marley, which is kind of in reference to what they have in their studio to protect their floor. And then tap dance, which is my core. Michael is the prompt for how I dealt with these floors, really. And tap dancers usually are relegated to these small tap floors if they do other performances. And so I was like, I'm gonna get, you know, you're gonna have a big floor, and, you know, maple wood, he said, was his best floor, and sprung wood. And the sound, you know, that it produced is lovely. The last thing I'll share before we cut, because I know we have to go on, is that, you know, these floors were protected up until the day of the exhibit, and no one touched those floors until they touched them. So I had a private ceremony on August 3rd at 4 p.m. And one by one, each one of them were able to step on the floor for the first time. And they were the first person to dance on that floor. And they were able to leave their trace or their mark, whether visible or invisible. And so that was like a very big part of the conceptual framework for, it's like to present a floor to a dance floor, to present a dance floor to a dancer, but also to create a space where the exhibit dances and the dancer doesn't have to exhaust themselves, you know? So that's what my process was with that one.
I'm gonna recap and then ask one more question, because I want to get to mask, conceal, carry, and then we'll open the floor. But yeah, no, to all of those points, that what struck me is that honoring of dance as a pedagogy, as a research practice. Like, that's literally enacted in the other side of the gallery space, where you have your research collection of books on the dancing Black body on display. You have your earlier work on the Philly Bop also on view. But then these floors, you know, which we don't see when we see the dancer activate, you know, the installation in contemporary art, we don't see the proper floors. They're just kind of tossed in whatever the institution has. Is underpaid, not credited, possibly as an artist in their own right, which if you need someone to activate it, they should be in theory a collaborator, right? And the way in which this reverses all of those things, but doesn't have, you know, the dancer activating the space. Like, it's all within the work. It's within, as the title implies, the implied presence of what that body does. It also reminded me of, you know, when I say like dance as a pedagogy, I have this very vivid memory of like, I'm like 10 years old, hanging out with my sister's side of the family on her dad's side, and I didn't know how to do the Tootsie Roll. And these older women cornered me in the kitchen, and they like stayed with me for 35 minutes, right? And they were like, this is how you do the Tootsie Roll. And like, that's how I learned. But that's how I learned. I didn't like learn it in the club or, you know, on my own. I learned it from this like generational thing. And that there's something I was also accessing, right? Of like, I was being passed down something about how to move my hips and my thighs and my legs in that way. That I think also just, it stayed with me as I was walking through that show of just this is also its own form of storytelling,
Absolutely.
of passing down memories that's being revered in such a way. So to that end, and this will be the last kind of prompt, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. I do want to talk about mass concealed carry, and we've talked around a lot of the themes that are on display in that exhibition with the kind of gestures towards BDSM, the ambiguity of violence, but what we haven't gestured towards specifically is the implied presence of the gun, right?
Yeah.
And I, of course, read the interview with New York Times on it. But what I think was possibly missing, and not in a bad way, but what I was like, oh, here's an opportunity to speak on it, is the ambiguity of the gun within Black culture.
Yes.
That, the gun is something that in my own work I've talked about with regards to film and video art. To shoot is not an accidental verb to activate the gun in the camera. Like, it's always been intentional. And how a lot of our relationships with Black images is about shooting the Black body in that way. And so what this particular excavation of your relationship with the concealed permanent, with shooting, with the 3D imprints of like housing the gun that make up some of the objects on display, is about not just that ambiguity, but around the spaces in which the gun is something that, yes, sure, is this threatening force that we know all too intimately targets the Black body and has always been a target of the Black body. But then there's also that kind of vernacular, is maybe the best word I can think of growing up, shooting guns, of safety, of, really thinking critically about what does it mean to be safe, and how I don't believe, and this is what I mean by the opening in that article, I don't think when I say what safety looks like for Black women or Black individuals, shooting, I don't think that's the same language of, Second Amendment or any of that. And I think that always gets collapsed, but I hear and see in your work that you're doing something else with that. And I'd love for you to just take this last bit of time to speak on that, because I do think that people might look at the show and think of it as a contradiction of sorts, right?
Yeah.
I don't see there to be a contradiction whatsoever, because I think it's gesturing towards a whole other history.
Yeah, it's a whole other history. But I enjoy having a hostile relationship with my audience. It's like if they feel like they can figure me out, this is a bad day, or I'm doing the wrong thing. It's on the core element. I'm not a part of any of those groups. I'm not part of a collective or any of those kind of things that are dominating the larger conversation. It's weird. I just tend to do these works. I mean, it's just in nature. I am a person that can, or in my way, I identify particular systems, and then there's something that I say that this is urgent, right? And so this is an urgent, that my relationship to this moment, and a lot of the material behind this show is about an urgency, and it just became something that I couldn't take out. So I think this work is very much in conversation with I prayed to the wrong God for you, to be honest, because it just was something that was just very urgent. But yeah, I think that the way to talk about it in the brief amount of time that we have here is that it is something that I was not able to have because it is very gendered. Like growing up in the South, the guns were so natural, especially in the South, around hunting, but also just about like protection. I did not get that as a girl child, right? I didn't get to inherit the granddaddy's gun and 6-shooter and all this other stuff. Those things were still had a particular kind of, the men in the family, they go do that, and you're just like a little girl, and you don't go do it. So there's also like this kind of a abandonment or being out on your own when kind of shit hits the fan. You gotta figure out your positionality. So for me, I've said this is for years. I people know I've been interested in trying to get a license to carry for a lot of reasons. I am a woman that is read sometimes as a man, and I get like hollered at and yelled and approached in certain kinds of ways. I've experienced a lot of violence from a lot of different scenarios, and I also deal with a particular amount of equipment and navigate a particular area of the city at different times of the hours of the night. So there's a basic protection around like self-defense and awareness. But there's a particular thing with this one. I took the time to understand the device. I wanted to understand my proximity. I have an affection for guns. And it's like, it's something in the sense of like I mean, in general, I have this thing is like, I have to kind of have a affection for an object to deal with it.
Yeah.
But wanting to understand how to not only to handle it, but think about its relationship and power and the way that these things have evolved, which is why some of, like the work that's up now, the swordsman, I create this it's a bit of a fabulation, right? There's no 100 round extended clip like this. Like these are bronzes also, right? So it's called the swordsman's, and the series of bronze, the fiefs of ruthful specters, is thinking very much about what is inherited, specifically within Black culture, Black communities that I know I'm in, like live in, especially in Philly. People inherit these weapons as these protections of these like fiefdoms, you know what I mean? Like the streets and things like that. But it's with sorrow, it leads into a particular kind of like, pushing out of things. So I just wanted to get closer to that, and also use this as an opportunity to kind of like, in my own way, when I say talk about, I use my work to talk, like it's like a language for me. So I wanted to kind of get into just it's another ordeal. Like I was like, I wanted to go train, I wanted to do this, and it hurt me so bad that I was suffering in the excellence that I wanted to do. Then I was like thinking about my whole other training, which is like was something that's been in my life often as an athlete, but bringing it back, getting back in shape and weight training in a pretty aggressive way. Training to failure was, like how I leveled it, because you actually have to hurt to gain. You know what I mean? You have to push yourself to a certain part. There was this thing where it's, at the core, I told people, I was like, I would go in between these spaces of saying, people are like, what is the show about? And I'm like, oh, I'm trying to tame a bullet. And then one day I'm like, oh, I'm trying to, deal with this like trembling, this shaky language, do something for once that's like, within that. And shout out to whoever put the thing about the glissant, because that's exactly what I'm talking about when I say tremble. People know about glissant and like opacity and things like that, but I really am enamored by his concept of trembling. Like if the work doesn't tremble, like you maybe not doing the thing. And I felt like this time I could not come out of this, what I feel is a psychotic moment in the world, without a work that shook me down. Like that's something that actually still makes me nervous, and down to the language. So that's what that's what I'll share now, is like that's some of the things that are in there. And then there's other stuff that'll come out where I'll go deeper into each like body of work. But for now, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I believe the virtual mic is open for audiences if there are any questions that need to be passed down.
Yes, thank you both immensely for this talk. Let's see, we're going to turn it over to actually Chloe, who's going to ask on behalf of someone who put a question in the chat.
Hi, Tiona. Hi, Ayanna. Thank you so much for that conversation. We have a question from Kathleen in the audience about the Friday Times and the 2-page article on your work, Tiona. Okay. And the question involves your studio as it's depicted in that article. There's medieval dress armor on a mannequin and another mannequin head with same material fragment. And they're curious what you're referencing, how you think about subjugation and fashion, and how you think about, there's a photo of a dressed gentleman with a security or law enforcement medal, kind of getting at some of the meanings inherent in those images.
Okay, law enforcement medal. Like, try to think about, I gotta pull up the New York Times. I don't even know what's going on. But yeah, no, let me look at this picture so I can read this image right quick, because I'm like, I know. Let's see, let me see. So I haven't even. All right. Oh, okay. All right. So the first picture is me. And then you talking about a picture in the studio. All right. So, gotcha. Let's start with my grandfather. That is my dear papa. So that is, yeah, my grandfather. And what he's holding is something that is very rare to a lot of Black families, which is a family crest. And so this is a great way to actually read through this image. So he's holding this family crest, and what it has on it is like the original crest for the McClodden clan, which is a Scottish Irish clan. And the tartan behind it is also something that is like explicit in that. When I saw that image, that's how I got into particular research to understand that the McClodden clan was skilled with chainmail and armor. And so my grandfather and all the men in my family and father, everybody's like military enforcement. My mother's side is domestic worker, seamstress. Like my mom sewed my clothes up until like 6th grade. And so I wanted a material to start to deal with that could bring me into both sides, like something that is like cloth, but also like armor, or is like something that suggests war. So my Be Alarmed series is when I first started engaging with the chainmail. So the chainmail that you're seeing in my studio is in progress. Like I'm back here to get that work done. Which is going to be a full body chainmail like piece for my body. It's going to be an exhibit. I'm not going to talk too much about what the exhibit it is, but it'll be my last exhibit of the year that'll open at the end of October at El Museo del Barrio in a show that's curated by Olga Viso. And so this is just kind of like a constant evolution of that. And I don't know about like subjugation and fashion. I mean, like, the only thing I will say is like kind of what we talked about earlier, like what I talked about with Ayanna about like seeing people who wear BDSM gear as fashionable. I guess like it's like sometimes disorienting. I mean, I know Balenciaga got New York in a fucking chokehold right now because I'm seeing the affordable versions of what folks got on, and I'm like very confused by that. But yeah, I mean, I don't. It's part of it. There's a part that is aestheticized and that is beautiful. It's a way that you also see each other. So I don't really care either way, Yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you. Let's see, we just got one from TOS. TOS, I can unmute you or ask on your behalf as you'd like. I'm just, for the sake of time, going to read it out loud. They're asking, do you also seek to address the universality of violence and the institutionalization of violence emanating from patriarchal dominationism, violence-based culture as a whole?
No. What else to say? Yeah, I'm not doing all that. Yeah, I'm like usually coming from a very focused place. I don't do that ahead of the thing. I think like the scholars and the writers do that, and I let them do whatever they want. But for me, no, I'm not thinking about the larger society and trying to make sense of that while I'm in the studio.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Darla, I see you here. Can I unmute you? You can ask for yourself here. Well, you know what, Darla, we can't hear you. Although you are on mute. Let's see, try one more time. Let's see. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, we can't. I'll read it for you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why. Okay, Darla's question is in the chat. It seems to me that the art world thrives on public performance of Black trauma. If at all, how do you think about the possibility of re-traumatizing yourself or setting off traumatic responses within Black people who encounter your work, who are less familiar with the language / gear of BDSM?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my work is very much supported in this case because I help kind of clear whatever language is there. But I don't, with my work, I think that's probably part of the trembling aspect. If there is trauma there, it's not intentional, or that's not my goal. But I have to be honest to myself. I'm not going to move within this smallness, and I think that it's very good to think about this question because there's this idea of like Black trauma being something that just exists or traumatizing of Black people, when there's actually Black trauma that can be exchanged by other Black people, right? So I'll say, like, for me, and especially with BDSM or anything that I do, is that, you know, I'm a Black queer woman, autistic. I've suffered violence at a major scale from a lot of white people. Like, there's a lot of people who haven't dealt with what it feels like to be in the South and be me, like as a kid, the stuff that I dealt with. But then there's this other thing where, you know, I like to always put on the table is that, you know, I've sat at tables with people who look like me who trying to kill me, you know, who try to say stuff because of my sexuality, because, you know, queer folks, and let me stop saying queer folks, the LGBTQT community, they have marginalized the BDSM community, right? Like, there was a moment where they deemed that community the repository of AIDS, like, and we're like, straight up on some, like, you know, I mean, it came back again with the whole like thing that where they said that they didn't want the BDSM community to be a part of the pride. So there's something like, I think that I think I'm at this place, and it's part of my getting older. If my crotchety like getting old feeling come up, is because I'm like, actually, I want to deal with everything. Like, I want us to like call out that can happen with each other, but also can happen with this larger thing. When I teach my students, which I'm starting to teach a little like undergrads at Princeton for this Princeton Arts Fellowship, and if I'm able to keep teaching, which I like to, I oftentimes in art, and this is the art programs, oftentimes have to get them to stop talking about how their acknowledgement of them being in a white space in a way that it stops them from doing their work. And you know, I go into these studio visits, and that's why I had to stop them for a while. And the students are like, they're telling me about what they're doing, they're whispering, and I'm just like, what the hell's going on? What the hell's going on? And I'm just like, you know, you got to make your work, you know. And I'm like, if that means you maybe take your stuff home or something, but like, you got to make that work. But then on the other hand, I'm very interested in fortifying people, and when I say fortify, meaning like preparing you for a war, preparing you to be in a defense with language. I don't like people who do these things, but they don't read, or they put stuff out, and, you know, like they're handling things that, you know, like Black folks who handle things that are of a very different Black community that they would never talk to type stuff. Like, if you're going to handle the material, be like, you know, you don't have to, if the least that you could do is study, the least that you could like sit, do, and, you know, listen type thing. So I'm kind of at this place that's almost like very confrontational. That's why I say it's very hostile, maybe even toxic, you know what I mean? Where I'm like, I kind of want us to get in it, you know, because this like timid, like for a couple of people that don't exist thing, I can't deal, like, I don't let that come into my studio, but I do see it as a real thing. You know, MoMA, I told them, I said, I'll let y'all know when I start getting hate mail, you know, I'll let y'all know when people, but I'll also like kind of cherish it a little bit, because I feel like that's part of like what you know, I'm staking my claim, like I'm here too, you know. Yeah.
If I can piggyback on that response briefly, it reminds me of Bell Hooks' Loving Blackness as political resistance, where she talks about talking to her students and the ways in which Black bodies are subjugated through any institution is only to see themselves as the minoritarian figure.
Yes.
So ways that I can only understand myself in response to the white eyes around me, as opposed to how do you just understand yourself in the work that you're doing. And when I was a professor, that was very much what I had to, that was the main task of like, how to actually speak to you to give you tools of empowering yourself just to do the work.
Absolutely.
Rather than trying to then think about what it means for you to be here with white eyes staring at your body. Because you're then just indoctrinating yourself. You're actually doing the work of the institution without the institution having to work. You're internally.
Exactly. I've had enough. That's what I think I've seen, and what's continually happening is a lot of that kind of work is out, you know, like, and I'm like, it's thriving because you're actually legible now, because you just told these people how to handle you. People don't know how to handle me, right? That's my pride and joy. Like, I like, and I mean that. Like, but it also, I like to, like, it's in my life too, because I'm like, I'm around the difficult ones. I like that. Like we sit, it might be a little front, you know, that's where I'm at right now. And I think that's a freedom point for me. And it like keeps the work exciting, you know, because that's why I even said that social change thing that people are questioning me about in the Times article where I was like, you know, social change creeps up in my work, it's got to go. It
Yeah.
only comes actually from what that work means in terms of its legibility, in
Yeah.
terms of its proselytizing that it can do something. And I don't think that I expect my work to do anything other than what it does for me, right? Like,
Yeah.
it could be a really, like, you could really hand yourself on a platter, like, hey, take me in. Like, I don't know. I think like it should be a little bit more wilder right now, you know, especially what we're going through. I'm like, like it should be wild. So yeah.
Thank you both so much for those answers. I know we have a couple more questions in there, but I'm going to turn it over to our closing poetry reading, which we've been really looking forward to today. I'm thrilled to introduce Asiya Wadud here to close us out. Asiya Wadud is the author of several poetry collections. Most recently, No Knowledge is Complete Until It Passes Through My Body. Her recent work appears in Eflux Journal, Bomb, Triple Canopy, Poetry, and elsewhere. Asiya's work has been supported by the Foundation Jen Michalski, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Dance Space Project, Finnish Cultural Institute of New York, Rosendahl Theater Norway, and Princeton Festival des Arts, among others. I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for this talk today. I feel like even though I'm right here, there's so much that that I want to revisit and sit with again. And I'm looking forward to having a chance to do that. And I just wanted to read, I think, depending on time, 2 or 3 poems that are maybe tangentially related to some of the things that we talked about. And I really have been thinking so much lately about drift and trace and movement that kind of takes its own place and takes its own speed in its own time. So these are some poems from an upcoming or forthcoming collection. And I think I'll read 2 of them and then I'll see where we are. Thanks for having me today. 221 and a half. Ochre drifts deliver the oysters, reprisal in their opening mouths. Each expels what it nurtured, other ovals all along. Onion skin parchment, onion skin fermented, all cultivated alliums. Ocean drift delivers all umber, prize from the low tide, gathered up the dispersed objects, made them an offering. Onion skin and overture, O and orange peeled, or singed parchment, O, or starboard, port O, or focal, O, or my mother's abject order, other O. 0 marks and absent, heart island overflow, effluence onward and grace, O, and in other languages we'd say, how I missed you, while we place our hands together, O, other islands with an expendable E. I am solvent, deciduous, morning birds nesting in their half-finished homes. They enter through the open window, shelf for their only songs, and operating theater slips and becomes diction, or the first night of Ramadan, the cleaved even song, spectacular in its lament and order, lone song, operatic or O, open against the horizontal seams, equatorial, O, open frontier or a sieve, catchment or a swift return, pilgrimage or gilded. An operating theater slips and becomes diction or other futures, spectacular in its lament or ordered only song. Imperative that the song finishes, let the song finish then. Sit inside the keening then, a single hymn for all of them. It begins the same way it ends, with the slipping of the long vowels and the shuddering of the others. A rowboat is a manual, as in hand over hand in what we sought. Soft O like oblong and original, or ordinance and horizon. Other islands with their expendable H, the breath we breathe into it. All the hours it takes to articulate the O, by the time we finish, our mouths are spent, days or hours of O work. Now other study streams build to music or grayscale, ocean, or nautical O. The drum is taught since all other sounds ring in order. We call it precision or song. Later we place the metronome on the island. It disregards the place. It keeps up its one dirge, lets it slip and finds its chorus. We place the instrument at the water's edge, but the pulse builds at the center. Salt keeps the water lifted, anathema or anthem or iron rich. Rearrange the parchment, make of it an envelope, place inside it the soft O. You too are elastic. You are elastic, the bend, the break, the give, the band, the bounce. You become elastic by night at the orange table when it's on fire. The flames governed us and hovered butt up. We heard the give at the tangle and dissonance of tree tips. They quivered and hummed elastic. You have been the fretted bounce branch, its cool black core, unencumbered, fitted in the frame, then give, its elasticity evident. All evidence lives in the banner at the brim. You are elastic and hum. The magpies pierce silence with their clutter of noise, solace evident in the oak branches, blackened in the night sky, black the night sky. The nightingale calls its own cloistered song, doesn't ask why or hum or haven or horizon. The raven hovers, nimbus clouds get lower and drift. The crow recalls every ancient imprint. We try and help the crow move on. Magnet of its mind, circle and thrive, every ancient imprint. I have been afraid to draw end to end, the nose to wingtip, broken in split parallels at the wishbone. I am coasting towards Liguria. What bird did rest here? When the island succumbed to its own elastic, everyone knew, called the autumn from the tailwind, called the virtue from the other room, called them winter in the low season, called the coral birds in abiding songs. They want urgency, bruise them when it nests and nests where it brews. Quick timber crater then fall, wings governed by the ringed holes and then by helium. You have used a needle to cut through the tendrils. They sing out in discord, ring out imprudent. Be elastic, you urge any bird with movement. Be elastic, one trembling leaf, then the surge. Thank you.
Thank you, Asiya, so much. Brilliant. A link to Asiya's latest book is in the chat. Be sure to check that out. Go see the shows. Thank you again, Tiona, so much. Thank you, Ayanna. You can view the full archive of the NSE and today's recording on our YouTube channel. This one will be up shortly. We would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Barbara Pollack, Lu Shuyin, Miao Ying, and Lily Wei on the event of Mirror Image, a transformation of Chinese identity at Asia Society Museum. And we will conclude with a poetry reading by Abby Ramin. You can now turn your microphones on and say goodbye, hello, as you leave. Thank you all again so much for today.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Please do fix that smoke detector.
Thank you so much.